morning. It's good to be with you again this week. I was out last week celebrating my 25th birthday, and oh, okay. So I clearly look older than that? Okay. All right, well, noted. I'll remember that. Nonetheless, it is good to be with you again, and for our online community, we're so glad that y'all are here as well. We are wrapping up our series, More Than Enough. Before I do that, before we get launched in that, I want to make a comment about something that I know several of you are very concerned about, and so I want to go ahead and speak to it. I've received several notes of concern about the fluffiness of my beard, and I want you to know I'm shaving it this week, that this was not, the reason is I was peer pressured into this. It's not my fault. It was my brother-in-law's fault. It's all his fault. He made me grow this beard out for Thanksgiving week. And so for the love of all that's holy on Thanksgiving Day, I get to shave it, and I'm very excited about that. So for those of you who are concerned for my mental health based on the fluffiness of my beard, fear not, I'm going to be okay on Thursday. But this week is an important week in our life as a culture, in our life as a church. And part of my hope is that this series has prepared you to celebrate Thanksgiving a little bit more meaningfully this year, perhaps than in years past, as we look at the stories of the meals that Jesus shares that Luke records in Luke's gospel. So I hope that that part of the last couple of weeks has been preparing you for that. I loved our Thanksgiving meal as a church on Wednesday night, this past Wednesday night. If you were there, I think you probably would agree with me. It was so good to just be together without agenda, at least without agenda other than being together. That was the thing that we were there to do. And on Wednesday night, I was talking with a young couple who goes to this church, and they were telling me that in the last few weeks, they had the opportunity to go to dinner with another couple, and it was the kind of dinner that just stretched on and on and on, not because of poor service, but because it was just, there was room and space. There was time in that meal to connect meaningfully and deeply with each other. And they talked about how life-giving that was. I hope that for some of you, you've been able to reclaim mealtime as an important time, as Jesus kind of models for us, an important time, I think maybe for three things. One, to tell each other that you love each other, to teach each other a little something, and perhaps even to challenge each other. As we look at the stories of meals in Luke's gospel, I think this is what we see Jesus doing over and over again, loving, teaching, and challenging, loving, teaching, and challenging. We see Jesus inviting more and more people to the table. We see Jesus invite the powerful and the powerless. We see him invite the righteous and the unrighteous. We see him invite the rich and the poor. Everybody is invited to the table, and not even once does Jesus even hint that he wants fewer people at his table. The table that Jesus eats at seems to be expansive in its invitation. And so I hope that you begin to kind of catch a sense of what meal times could be for us, even in this day and age where we tend to rush through meals. Perhaps we could reclaim that. And so we're going to look at a story in Luke chapter 24 this morning that is the end of that series. It's the last chapter of Luke. But remember the journey that we have been on. We've looked at so many meals in Luke's gospel. We heard in Luke chapter 5 that Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he says, look, I came for those of you that are sick, not for those of you that are healthy. I came for those of you who are sick so that I can make you well. In Luke chapter 7, we hear Jesus forgiving the woman who the Pharisees, the church leaders, are standing back and looking at her and dismissing her because she's not the right kind of person to be at a dinner of this magnitude, but Jesus dismisses them in return and invites her to the table and forgives her sin and heals her. We hear in Jesus in Luke chapter 9 about the feeding of the 5,000, where there is always more than enough. There is an abundance at the table that Jesus prepares for us. In Luke 11, we hear Jesus challenge those Pharisees yet again, and he says this penetrating line. He says, you had the key to knowledge, but you didn't use it, and you kept other people from using it, right? And we heard that challenge, which I think is such a striking challenge challenge for us in the church today. We have the key to knowledge. It is Christ. Are we opening that door, or are we closing the door and keeping other people out? We heard in Luke chapter 14, that great parable of the great banquet with the relentless invitation of God, who, when the first folks reject him, sends his servants out again and again and again, relentlessly inviting people until the house is full and the banquet can be enjoyed by so many people. We heard last week in Luke 22 the story of the Last Supper, right? And Jesus reinterpreting the Passover meal in light of himself, in light of the sacrifice that he's making. And this week will be 2 chapters after that in Luke chapter 24. Like I said, it's the last chapter in Luke's gospel. It is not the last meal that we hear in Luke's gospel. You're going to have to go find that on your own and read that because it's a good one. But it is the last meal that we're going to look at. And it starts on what you and I know of as Easter night. This is the same night that they found, that the women found the empty tomb that morning. This is Easter night when this story unfolds. And it's a story that I suspect some of you are familiar with. And so, as I always say with these stories that are a little bit better known, if you're super familiar with it, if you are perhaps too familiar with it, try for a few moments to just let some of that fade away and hear with new ears, perhaps not what I'm saying, but perhaps what the story is saying to you in this moment, at this season of your life. We join 2 disciples on the road to a town called Emmaus. They're leaving a place called Jerusalem. They're traveling 3 or 5 miles away from Jerusalem to a town called Emmaus. And this is, like I said, the night of Easter, right? Sunday morning, they find the tomb empty. So why are these disciples leaving Jerusalem, the center of the action? It's because even though you and I know the end of the story, we know that Jesus is risen. Remember that the end of this story is very much in doubt for those disciples on the first Easter Sunday. They don't know exactly what's happening. And so these 2 guys, or these 2 people, Clopas and his companion, are getting out of Dodge. And we don't know exactly why they're leaving town, but I think we can make a couple of guesses. I have 3 guesses, in fact, and maybe it's all 3 or maybe it's one of them. But my first guess is I think they're afraid. I think Clopas and his companion, these 2 disciples who have followed Jesus for some period of time, I think they're afraid because they just saw their leader executed, and they expect that the followers of a rogue rebellion are going to be persecuted as well. And so they're saying, we're not going to hang out here. The other disciples have locked themselves in the upper room, but these 2 smart guys have gotten out of Dodge. I think part of them is afraid. There's some fear active in their lives, and you and I know a little bit about what that's like. I think a second guess is perhaps they are confused. They thought they knew how the story was going to go. Right? They thought they knew who Jesus was. They thought they knew what Jesus was going to do, and none of it happened, or at least apparently. None of it happened. And so I think they're confused about what's supposed to happen next, and they're just running. They're just running away in that moment of confusion, and probably you and I know a little bit about confusion or lack of clarity as well. The third thing that I think might be rumbling around for these guys is they're just untethered. Right? When something totally unexpected happens in your life, sometimes it has an untethering effect. You thought your life was going to look a certain way, and then some event, something happens that changes the whole story. The whole plan has blown up. I think for these guys, they are untethered and perhaps experiencing even a little bit of despair because they thought they knew how the rest of their lives was going to go. And now they know nothing. And in those moments of blindness where we can no longer see our future, I think a despair tends to set in. Maybe it was one of those reasons, maybe it was all 3. For whatever reason, these 2 guys are getting out of Dodge as fast as they can. And so we're going to join them on that journey on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And when this scene kind of opens up in the middle of Luke 24, what we hear is that they're rehashing the story, right? They're rehearsing all that's happened. And this is something you and I do too, right? You get in the car after the dinner or after the meeting and you say, can you believe he did that? Or you say, can you believe she said that? I mean, I know none of you do that, but maybe it's just me. So we kind of rehash, we debrief, we talk about what just happened? And I think that's the story that's unfolding before us. And as they're kind of talking to each other, trying to figure out what just happened, a stranger shows up on the road with them. And the stranger says, hey, what you talking about? And the two of them stop, and it says they stop in a moment of sadness. And they look at the stranger and they say, are you serious? Are you the only person who has no idea what has happened in Jerusalem this weekend? And the stranger says, what are you talking about? What things? What things have happened in Jerusalem this weekend? I can relate to that. What's happening? I don't know. So they begin to unfold the narrative. They say there was a man named Jesus, and he was a mighty prophet in word and in deed, but our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be crucified, and he has died. But some of the women have found the tomb was empty, and they might think he's alive, but we're not really sure what to think. And they say this to the stranger. They say, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And that sentence is really important. I don't generally have a great affinity for grammar, but in this moment, grammar could be helpful. They say, we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. That means hope is in the past. That past tense means we no longer hope he's the one to redeem Israel. Hope resides for these two in the past. They thought that Jesus was going to be the one to conquer Rome and expel the Roman army from Jerusalem. They thought that Jesus was going to be the one to redeem Israel and restore Israel to a place of power and independence and prosperity. But that hope was nailed to a cross and no longer lives within them. They tell the stranger about these women who are thinking some crazy things. I think this might be Margaret's favorite part because we know that the women are right and the guys are wrong. But they tell the stranger, we don't know what they're talking about. The tomb is empty, but we don't really know what's happening. And the stranger in response says this, how foolish you are and slow of heart you are to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And then it says that starting with Moses and all the prophets, the stranger began to explain these things, all these things in the scripture about the Messiah to these two disciples, Clopas and his companion. And man alive, I wish we knew. I wish we knew what was shared in that moment. I wish we knew what this stranger unraveled, revealed to these two disciples about who the Messiah was, about what the scriptures had to say about who the Messiah was. But Luke doesn't tell us, and I just want to strangle him sometimes because I really want to know. So we don't know exactly what the stranger tells him, but I want to make a guess, and perhaps this is bold of me, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but for years now, I have wondered whether the stranger shared something like this with these two disciples on the road to Emmaus. I wonder if that stranger said, look, if through the first Adam, death entered the story, right? Remember, we're starting with Moses and all the disciples. Moses traditionally wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, so we're going all the way back to Genesis. And I wonder if he starts with, if through the first Adam, death entered our story, right? When you go back and read the creation story, there is no death before Adam and Eve's rebellion. Death is a consequence of Adam and Eve's rebellion. If through Adam, the first Adam, death entered our story, then through the Messiah, the last Adam, the curse of Eden has been defeated, as has death. I wonder if he shared after that if God commissioned Noah to deliver humanity from the coming flood of God's wrath, then through the Messiah, the second Noah, God delivers humanity once and for all from the consequences of sin. I wonder if this stranger on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus said to these two disciples, if God promised Abraham that through his descendants all the families of the earth would be blessed, then through the Messiah, a son of Abraham, the whole world has been invited to join the family of God. The whole world has been pulled into the story of blessing that began with God and Abraham. I wonder if that stranger on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus said, if God gives the law through Moses, right, this path to righteousness, this path to the good life, then through the Messiah, the second and greater Moses, God offers a new law and a new covenant that promises not to transform our lives, but to transform our hearts as well. I wonder if this stranger on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus happened to say to them, if God promised David that through one of his sons an eternal throne might be established, would be established on his shoulders, then the Messiah, a son of David, defeats death and claims that throne, claims that crown to an eternal throne, the kingdom of God. We don't know exactly what the stranger shared, but I think it was the whole story. I think it was the whole story of God's expansive plan throughout history to bring the world to this moment. The stranger gets done teaching. They keep walking on the road to Emmaus. They reach the exit ramp to Emmaus, whatever that looked like. And the stranger pretends like he's going to keep on walking, but the two disciples, Clopas and his companion, say, no. You got to stay with us tonight. Stay with us. It's getting late in the day. Come inside and share a meal with us. And I want you to hear what happens in that meal, because what happens in the meal is the climax of this story, perhaps even the climax of the gospel if you look at it a certain way. When the stranger was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. See, Luke tells us in the opening sentence of this story that the stranger that joined these two disciples was Jesus. But the disciples couldn't see him. There was something that kept the disciples from seeing what was right in front of them. But this meal, this taking of bread, breaking it, blessing it, giving it to them, and giving thanks, there's something about that meal that's revelatory. There's something about that meal that removes the blindness from their eyes. There's something about that encounter. There is something about this encounter that suddenly takes the scales off our eyes and allows us to see, sometimes for the first time, that it is Jesus who stands right in front of us. It is Jesus who has been walking in the midst of our fear and confusion and despair the whole time. And then I hate that Jesus kind of pulls the Jedi trick and vanishes from their sight in a moment, and they're left not with Jesus. But they go on and they say, were our hearts not burning while he was talking to us on the road, right? This is what Clopas and his friends say, were our hearts not burning? It makes me think about John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, so many years ago, has a conversion experience with Christ and says that his heart was strangely warmed. I think it was the same kind of experience for John Wesley that it was for these two disciples, where our hearts not burning within us. And it says that immediately they got up and they returned to Jerusalem. And I think that is the hidden key to that story for me. Because these two disciples have a transformative encounter with Christ, and they cannot stay where they are. Not only can they not stay where they are, they get up immediately. They don't wait for tomorrow. They don't wait to come up with a plan. They don't wait until they think it's safer. They get up immediately, and they head right back into the teeth of danger. Right? Where they left Jerusalem in fear, they return in courage. There's something about meeting Jesus. There's something about a meal with Christ that it put courage into their heart. They left Jerusalem in confusion about who Christ really was and what was actually going to happen in the end. They return in clarity, knowing exactly who Jesus is and what he's done. They left Jerusalem in despair, thinking their lives as they thought they knew them was over, and they return in hope. not a wishful thinking kind of hope, but the kind of certain hope that comes knowing that Christ lives. There is something about this meal. There is something about the meal that these disciples shared that changed the trajectory of their lives and our lives as well. Friends, as we get ready for Thanksgiving this week, as we gather around tables, whatever that looks like for you, if that's family, great. If that's friends, great. Whatever Thanksgiving looks like for you this week, I pray that you will gather in gratitude, not for the material blessings of your life, although that's an important thing to give thanks for too, but gather in thanks that Christ comes still, that Jesus meets us today, just like he met those disciples on the road to Emmaus 2,000 years ago. He meets us to tell us that he loves us. He meets us to teach us about who God is and how we're called to live. And he meets us to challenge us. That's worth giving thanks for. If you're going to do the Thanksgiving thing, make it matter. Make it about things that are truly life-changing this year. Not the surface level things, although those are good. But make it about the very heart of our faith, that we give thanks this year for a God who comes for us, for a God who invites all of us, without exception, to the table, and then sends us out, and then sends us back into the teeth of a world that needs this meal. That's the kind of Thanksgiving I want to be a part of. The kind where we meet Christ and are not left there.